Episode 1: Decisions, Actions, and Roles. Q1: What counts as an appropriate action when a plan starts going wrong? Usually the smallest step that actually addresses the real problem, not the most dramatic one. I try to take the appropriate action for the situation as it actually is, rather than reacting to how alarming it feels in the moment. Q2: How do you know when you've reached a genuinely final decision versus one you might still reverse? Honestly, when I stop actively looking for reasons to change my mind. A final decision feels different from a tentative one. There's a kind of settledness to it that arrives once the real thinking is actually done. Q3: What's usually the crucial part of a project that determines everything else? The initial framing, almost always. Getting the crucial part right early, defining what success actually means, shapes every decision that follows far more than any single execution detail later on. Q4: Do you think most people take their essential role in a team seriously enough? Mostly yes, though it varies. People generally understand their essential role, but it's easy to underestimate how much a small, quiet contribution actually holds the rest of the structure together. Q5: What does it mean to genuinely play a key role, rather than just being present? Being the person something would actually fall apart without, honestly. Playing a key role isn't about visibility. Some of the most important contributions are the least noticed until they're suddenly missing. Q6: What's usually the major cause behind recurring problems in a routine? Something small left unaddressed for too long, almost every time. The major cause is rarely one dramatic event. It's usually a minor friction point nobody bothered to fix when it was still easy to fix. Q7: How do you tell a major problem apart from something that just feels urgent in the moment? I ask whether it'll still matter in a month. A genuine major problem tends to survive that question. Something that only feels urgent right now often fades once the initial stress passes. Q8: What do you do the moment you face a problem you weren't expecting? Pause before reacting. Honestly, that single pause changes almost everything. Choosing to face a problem calmly, rather than panicking immediately, tends to produce a far clearer next step. Q9: Can a task present a challenge even if it looked simple on paper? Constantly, actually, the gap between planning and doing is where most surprises hide. Something can present a challenge that nobody anticipated, simply because reality always has more detail than a plan accounts for. Q10: How do you weigh an increased risk against a potentially bigger reward? Carefully, and usually by asking what happens in the worst case, not just the best one. I'm willing to accept an increased risk only when I could genuinely live with the downside if it actually happened. Q11: What usually becomes the main focus once a project actually gets underway? Something different from what I expected at the start, more often than not. The main focus tends to shift once real constraints show up. Plans are useful, but reality always has the final say. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 2: Knowledge, Learning, and Explanation. Q1: What's a basic principle you rely on that most people overlook? Honestly, just doing the boring, obvious thing consistently. That basic principle, consistency over intensity, has quietly outperformed almost every clever shortcut I've ever tried instead. Q2: How do you give a brief overview of something complicated without oversimplifying it too much? I focus on the shape of the idea, not every detail. A good brief overview should leave someone with an accurate, if incomplete, picture, not a false sense that they now understand the whole thing. Q3: Did your time at an educational institution actually prepare you for real work? Partly, honestly, more for how to think than for the specific tasks themselves. An educational institution taught me structure and discipline, but most of the practical skills I actually use, I picked up afterward. Q4: How much prior knowledge do you usually assume when explaining something to someone new? As little as reasonably possible. Now, I've learned that assuming too much prior knowledge is the fastest way to lose someone early in an explanation, even unintentionally. Q5. What makes a good explanation genuinely helpful rather than just technically correct? Meeting the listener where they actually are, honestly. I try to give an explanation that starts from something they already understand, then builds outward, rather than starting from where I happen to already be. Q6. How comfortable are you when you have to give information you know someone won't want to hear? More comfortable than I used to be, though it's never entirely easy. I try to give information clearly and kindly, without softening it so much that the actual message gets lost in the process. Q7. What's your first move when you need to find information quickly under pressure? Going to the most reliable source first, even if it's slower, rather than the fastest one. I'd rather take an extra minute to find information I can actually trust than move fast on something shaky. Q8. When do you feel you genuinely need someone to provide guidance, rather than just answers? When the problem is more about judgment than facts, honestly. I'd rather someone provide guidance, helping me think it through, than simply tell me what to do without explaining the reasoning. Q9. How important is it for a workplace to provide access to the tools people actually need? Hugely important, and often underestimated. When a company fails to provide access to basic tools, people quietly build workarounds that cost far more time than the tool itself would have. Q10. What's a recent moment where a small comment gave you a genuine new insight? Actually, a casual remark from someone outside my field once completely reframed how I thought about a stuck problem. That kind of new insight rarely comes from within the same small circle you've already been thinking in. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 3. Change, Growth and Systems. Q1. Do you feel like the tools you use change rapidly enough to keep up with, or too rapidly? Honestly, sometimes too rapidly. The moment I feel comfortable, something changes rapidly again. I've learned to hold my habits a bit loosely now, since clinging too tightly to one version of a tool rarely pays off for long. Q2. What's something in your life or work that seems to grow rapidly once it gets started? Small habits, oddly, momentum builds faster than people expect. Once something starts to grow rapidly, even a tiny consistent effort compounds into something much bigger than the initial input suggested it would. Q3. How do you keep your energy remain stable through a demanding week? Mostly by protecting sleep and one non-negotiable break, honestly. Keeping my energy remain stable, rather than swinging wildly, matters more to overall output than any single burst of extra effort. Q4. Have you ever had to work with a modified version of a plan that changed halfway through? Yes, often plans rarely survive their first contact with reality unchanged. I've gotten better at accepting a modified version gracefully, rather than treating any deviation from the original as a kind of failure. Q5. How do you feel about relying on one big integrated system versus several smaller separate tools? I lean toward the integrated option now, honestly, despite some resistance to switching. A single integrated system removes a lot of the friction that comes from constantly moving information between disconnected tools. Q6. Is it satisfying to switch on/off a device or a system and have it just work? Genuinely, yes, more than it should be. Something as simple as being able to switch on/off a system reliably feels like a small luxury once you've dealt with tools that don't behave that predictably. Q7. How do you make adjustments to a plan without losing sight of the original goal? I keep the goal written down somewhere visible, honestly, and check every change against it. Make adjustments along the way is normal, but only if they still clearly serve the same underlying purpose. Q8. What do you do when a tool or method have limitations you didn't anticipate? I try to work around the gap rather than force the tool to do something it wasn't built for. Recognizing that something have limitations early saves a lot of frustration compared to discovering it under pressure. Q9. How do you use the early stage of a project to set a good pace for everything after? Deliberately slower than feels natural, honestly. Using the early stage to build solid habits and clear expectations pays off far more than rushing to look productive in the very first week. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 4. Comparing differences and similarity. Q1. Have you ever expected two options to be similar and found them entirely different instead? Constantly, actually, assumptions about similarity are usually wrong more often than expected. Two things that look alike on paper can turn out to be entirely different once you actually try using them side by side. Q2. What's the most obvious difference between how you worked a few years ago and how you work now? Patience, honestly. I plan more and rush less than I used to. That obvious difference shows up in almost everything now, from how I write emails to how I approach unexpected problems. Q3. Do two versions of the same task ever end up totally different in practice? Surprisingly often, yes. The same instructions handled by two different people can produce totally different results, which taught me to write much clearer, more specific instructions than I used to bother with. Q4. Have you noticed a positive correlation between preparation and how calm you feel under pressure? Definitely, there's a fairly consistent positive correlation there, in my own experience. The more genuinely prepared I am beforehand, the less anything unexpected manages to actually rattle me in the moment. Q5. Can a small delay significantly affect the outcome of a much bigger project? Yes, more than people expect. A short delay early on can significantly affect everything downstream, especially if other people's timelines were quietly depending on yours without you realizing it. Q6. How strongly influenced by other people's opinions are you when making a personal decision? Less than I used to be, honestly, though I still value input. I try to stay strongly influenced by facts and my own judgment first, and treat outside opinions as useful context rather than the deciding factor. Q7. How do you organize related information so it's easy to find again later? I group by purpose rather than by date, usually. Keeping related information together, even if it was created at different times, makes it far easier to find later than sorting purely chronologically. Q8. How much detailed information do you actually need before making most everyday decisions? Less than I assume going in, honestly. I've noticed I often gather far more detailed information than the decision actually requires, mostly just to feel more confident rather than because it's strictly necessary. Q9. When comparing options, do you consider various aspects equally or focus on just one? I try to weigh several various aspects together rather than fixating on one, since optimizing for a single factor often quietly sacrifices something else that mattered more than I initially realized. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 5. Assessment and Quality. Q1. How important is it to you that a process produces consistent results over time? Extremely important, honestly, sometimes more than raw performance itself. I'd rather trust a process with consistent results than one that occasionally performs brilliantly but fails unpredictably the rest of the time. Q2. What does it take to measure something with great accuracy rather than a rough estimate? Patience, mostly, and a willingness to double-check. Getting great accuracy usually means resisting the urge to stop at the first plausible-looking number and verifying it a second time instead. Q3. Is there an idea you currently have that you think has great potential but hasn't gone anywhere yet? Actually, yes, something I've sketched out but haven't had the bandwidth to properly pursue. I think it has genuine great potential, but potential alone clearly isn't enough without dedicated time behind it. Q4. Do you prefer working at a high level of abstraction or getting into fine detail? Both, depending on the stage, honestly. I like starting at a high level to get direction right, then dropping into detail once the broad shape actually makes sense to commit to. Q5. How do you stay motivated in a highly competitive environment without burning out? By focusing on my own progress rather than constant comparison mostly. A highly competitive environment can be energizing in small doses, but treated as a constant benchmark, it wears people down fast. Q6. What's something in your work that's highly sensitive to small mistakes? Client communication, honestly, a small wording slip can shift a whole relationship. Anything highly sensitive like that gets an extra review from me before it goes out, no matter how rushed the day is. Q7. What makes a system or a process feel genuinely well designed to you? When you barely notice it, honestly, good design tends to disappear into the background. A well-designed process just quietly works, without demanding constant attention or workarounds from the people using it. Q8. How do you make sure your explanations are readily understood by people outside your field? I test them on someone unfamiliar with the topic first, honestly, before trusting my own judgment. If it's not readily understood by them, it usually means I've skipped a step I didn't realize I was assuming. Q9. Is a relatively simple solution always better than a more sophisticated one? Usually, yes, all else being equal. A relatively simple solution is easier to maintain and explain, and I've learned to be suspicious of complexity that doesn't clearly earn its keep. Q10. How do you handle a situation generally considered too risky to attempt? I try to separate the reputation of the idea from the actual evidence behind it. Something generally considered risky isn't automatically wrong. Sometimes it's just unfamiliar, which is a very different problem to solve. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 6. Individuals, the physical world and examples. Q1. How do you balance individual needs with what's best for the whole team? Carefully, and usually case by case, honestly. I try to respect individual needs wherever I reasonably can, while still being clear when something has to serve the group over any one person's preference. Q2. Are you someone who pays attention to the physical properties of objects, texture, weight, that sort of thing? More than I used to admit, actually. I've noticed the physical properties of a well-made object, how it feels, how it holds up, genuinely change how much I enjoy using it day to day. Q3. How do you identify factors that are actually driving a recurring problem, rather than just symptoms? I try to trace things backward rather than reacting to whatever's most visible. To properly identify factors behind a pattern, you usually have to look 1 or 2 layers beneath the obvious first explanation. Q4. How much do external factors, versus your own effort, determine how something turns out? Honestly, more than people like to admit, in both directions. External factors shape outcomes constantly, which is exactly why I try not to judge my own effort purely by results I couldn't fully control. Q5. Can you give a specific example of a small habit that made a real difference for you? Sure, writing down one thing I'm grateful for each morning, actually. It sounds small, but as a specific example, it's quietly shifted my mood on genuinely difficult days more than I expected it to. Q6. When does a plan seem unlikely to work, in your honest opinion, even before you've tried it? When it depends on too many things going right at once, honestly. If a plan would seem unlikely to survive even one small setback, I usually build in a fallback before committing to it fully. Q7. How do you know when a significant amount of your time is being spent on something that doesn't matter? I track roughly where my time goes for a week, occasionally, just to check my assumptions. It's uncomfortable to discover a significant amount of effort quietly going somewhere that isn't actually a real priority. Q8. What makes a complex problem feel more manageable once you actually start working on it? Breaking it into smaller, separately solvable pieces, almost always. A complex problem stops feeling overwhelming the moment you stop trying to hold the whole thing in your head all at once.